So welcome everybody, welcome to all our speakers and welcome to our people who are attending and visiting this meeting with Zoom. I can see from the attendee list that we have people from all over the United Kingdom, but also from many different locations internationally. So welcome to you all. Before we go any further, we'd like to do some introductions. My name is Shirley Rigby. I'm Senior Tutor at Warwick Medical School here in the Midlands in England. And I'm also an NHS consultant. I look after students who have problems, so I'm involved in student support, but I'm also an educational supervisor for trainees in general medicine and rheumatology, which is my specialty. I'd like to hand over to the speakers to introduce themselves, please.
So I'm Emma Pascall. I'm a paediatric cardiology trainee in London.
I'm Luke Forster. I'm a final year urology trainee in London.
And I'm Hussain Basheer. I'm a respiratory registrar, also in their final year.
That's great. Thank you very much all for joining us today. So I hope that you may have had the opportunity to hear the podcast, but don't worry if you haven't. It's available on the ASME website. The podcast focused on the learner or the trainee or the student and how best a student or doctor should manage disappointments in their careers. The speakers are going to recap this at the start of this webinar before going on to look more at the supervisor perspective. This podcast included a practical plan based on the speakers' experiences and the existing literature, and we'll be hearing some more about that from our speakers today. So there's just a few little housekeeping rules to talk about. The session will last approximately 45 minutes. We hope that this will be interactive, and we encourage anybody who's attending to be involved and to please post any comments or questions in the chat field. This is available by clicking on the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Please make sure that you select the option to post on the chat to panelists and attendees, otherwise it doesn't go to everybody, so that everybody can see what you've written. And if we don't get time to answer all the questions, we'll provide a document after the webinar with any questions that we have been unable to address. The chat field is also available for you to make some comments live with audio and video. And if you would like to do that, so if you'd like to chip in, please place in the chat feed that you're happy for us to do that and add you as a temporary panelist to join the discussion. The webinar is being recorded, and a video of the webinar will be made available on the ASME website. If you're having any technical problems this evening, we ask that you make ASME aware by emailing events@asme.org.uk, and I'll put that email in the chat. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to our first speaker, Emma Pascall. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you, Shirley. So I think we're going to start by just recapping a few things from our podcast, as Shirley said. So first thing to say is that we are not very good at talking about failure, and we're also not very good at researching or publishing our failure experiences either. So there's limited medical education literature about failure, but we've drawn on our common themes from psychology and from coaching and marketing to suggest a 3-stage practical guide to dealing with disappointment. So Luke's going to start off with the first stage.
Great, thanks. So in the podcast, I talked about sort of failure, and we all have different experiences of failure. A good example is medical school exam failures, and I remember well failing that second year exam and just all the different emotions you have. So just the sort of shock and sort of devastation. It feels like such a serious thing in that moment. So 15 years ago now for me, and it's, still look back and it's, I've got perspective now, but I recognize it was a really difficult time. So you're sort of shocked, you're stressed, you've got feelings of disappointment. Is it all worth it? Why have you put yourself through it? The whole process can be exhausting. What's even worse than that is postgraduate exams, where you have to then pay to redo them, and the financial cost and the sort of effect that it has on your family. You're sort of numb for a few days and often feel lonely. And you know, your peers or your friends might have passed the exam and they're out celebrating, and you're sort of devastated, you're sort of shocked. When I failed that second year exam, I missed out on a trip to Africa to do a sort of charity project that summer. And I think also you blame the system, you know, the exams are rubbish, you know, how they've marked, you know, how they marked this, it's unfair. So you've got all of these negative emotions, but what we would encourage you to do is try and turn that around. You can't blame yourself. These things happen. You've got to acknowledge that failure happens to all of us. You don't want to end up feeling like a victim. You don't want to personalize it or blame yourself or be sort of too harsh on yourself. The flip side is you can't really blame your sort of teachers or examiners too much either. I think you've got to admit that sort of medical school assessments or postgraduate assessments or whatever it is, applying for the grant or whatever, there's a system in place to assess you. It's never going to be perfect, but by that system you've come up short, and so it's not really healthy to say you're rubbish and it's all sort of your fault, and it's not healthy to say, well, it's actually the exam board's fault and all of and sort of take that route either emotionally. A really healthy way of looking at it is to look at it as a sort of delay in your progress rather than a defeat. And that's something that Watley talks about. And I think that's right. You can come back stronger. You can pass the exam next time. You can get the job the next time. And actually, instead of Acre in the happiness advantage talks about falling up rather than falling down. And this is the option that actually by going through this, you can come back stronger. So your knowledge might actually be better for having to do the exam another time, or if you've had to get extra experience before getting that job, you're actually going to be a better doctor. So you actually come out better. And you've got to have a bit of time to grieve. You're going to be angry. You're going to be sulking. You're probably not going to want to sort of talk to many people. But you need to get through that process. But it needs to be a time-defined process. So after a day or two, you need to say, that's it. And then you need to, what the psychologists call, take a walk. So clear your head, get through that emotion, and then you're sort of ready for the next stage and to start sort of reflecting on your situation, which Hussain is going to talk about.
Thanks, Luke. So I've got a big history of failures. I've also failed a lot of undergraduate and pretty much all of my postgraduate exams at least once. But one positive of failing that second year med school exam was that actually I met Luke trying to revise for our resit. So that's at least one positive. I'm going to talk a little bit about reflections. So it's got a little bit of a dirty word sort of in medicine recently, particularly with some very high profile cases recently brought against doctors. But actually, when we think of reflection as a personal skill, it can actually be very useful in sort of normalizing those emotions that you have when you experience failure. And in the podcast, my examples of failure are actually not just exams, but actually things that happened at work, and the sort of experiences we have at work, particularly in medicine on the shop floor, is that if you fail or things don't go to plan, it's not only you that ultimately is affected. There's other people, either patients or team. And so it's very important that you have a coping mechanism for when that happens. So the first thing is actually just that, normalizing it. So as you can see in the top left, failure is an integral component of research and scholarship. So it's part of the process of becoming an academic or a person dealing with failure, knowing how to bounce back, knowing how to reinvent your kind of your skills and your knowledge base from that. Luke mentioned there that sometimes you can become a better doctor because of the failures they're experiencing there. If at first you don't succeed, try again. So I'm sure we've all in postgraduate life have tried to submit, posters or abstracts or QI projects in places, and sometimes it can feel like you're getting up against a brick wall. But for those that are sort of big into their research, one small failure can actually feed into a much larger piece of work that will ultimately be successful. So just because you might not get that imminent hit of positivity doesn't mean that you should slow down. a lot of things, I think in medicine, you know, we're quite a competitive cohort, is actually learning when to say no or learning when to stop. Sometimes we feel forced to do something, or we feel like there's a type of character or level that we must get to because we see other people in that position. But ultimately, you've got to think about your needs. Do you really want to do this? Do you really want to try that again? And making sure that your focus, you know, on a daily basis, on a yearly basis, is ultimately focused on you and not a perceived model of what you think you should be. In the podcast, the best help I had to help me reflect was actually talking to a supervisor. So funny enough, it was actually my educational supervisor, but I met her on the shop floor pretty soon after a pretty horrible incident happened. And we'll talk a little bit later about supervisor skills, but ultimately when you're reflecting, normally to get into that mindset, it's useful to have someone else to prompt that in you rather than yourself, and particularly if it's a particularly emotional setting. Could this be a good thing? So we've got there Acres kind of mentioning of silver linings or a third path. Again, this kind of resonates with what Luke has started to talk about, in that things that happen can shape you, whether it be a personal thing, an academic thing. Ultimately, any experience is going to enhance how you respond in the future. And a kind of a formal way of how, you know, where do you start when you reflect is highlighted in that box on the left-hand corner. So trying to objectively assess, you know, what actually went wrong, what contributed to that failure, what were the key factors or the human factors that were involved. What would you do differently next time? What went well? You know, sometimes in particular exams, you might have done well on a certain topic, or found something, you know, particularly that you were good at. And then ultimately fixing down on what can you learn. And that might not be something that you find immediately. It might be something that you reflect on in a year's time, 10 years time, that actually you had that light bulb moment. So that's my reflections on failure. I'll hand over to Emma now, who's going to talk about the third stage.
Perfect. So I'm going to talk about the planning stage. So if we start in the top left corner again, so the first thing is to find a mentor and also a supervisor. So we've put these as different things because they may be the same person, but they also may be different people. So it just depends on the situation that you're in. So on the podcast, I gave an example of not getting the training job that I wanted. And so my mentor at that time was, you know, someone that had got the training job and was a trainee. And then a supervisor is more of a consultant who could give me different advice. And it's really important to use them as if you're having two separate people, and use their skills and what they could contribute and what they can advise for planning for the future. And so with those in mind, then it's important to set goals. So this could be an initial meeting after the failure. As we talked about, it's important to give yourself some time. So this might be a week or so later. And at that meeting to set a plan with realistic goals. So there's no point in having things that are unachievable, and also a time frame within which those goals could be achieved. And that means then later on you can keep track of how you're going through the planning stage. And so with that in mind, then think about opportunities. So again, it depends on the situation. But for example, for my situation, there are courses or podcasts or webinars or maybe different learnings from papers or books, and also teaching opportunities to really build an application and to improve an interview process. And those are things that the supervisor and the mentor can really help with, because sometimes it's difficult for the student to find these opportunities. So if the supervisor has courses that are emailed to them, then they can forward those on to the student as well. And then moving on, how can we make this a positive? So Luke and Hussain talked about this as well, and it's about finding that third path. So yes, it was a failure, but how are we going to make this into a positive, and how will you make this so that you actually do better in the long run. And this journey was actually a good journey because you learned a lot and you're now a better doctor for it. So that certainly resonates with me. I learned a huge amount from the year where I was a clinical fellow again after failing to get the training job. And I'm really pleased that I did spend that year out of training, because it meant that then when I went into training, I was slightly ahead, and I can try and stay ahead, and ultimately to try and improve as a doctor. And I think it's really important to think about where your long-term goal is. So it doesn't really matter about how long you take to get there, but if at the end of the day, when you get there, you're going to be a better doctor, teacher, whatever it is for it, then that's all that really matters. And then progress check is a really important phase, I think both for the student and for the supervisor. So to just make sure that this isn't a one-off meeting, that you write a plan, which sounds really good, but actually, are you achieving those goals? And are they still realistic? Are there any things that have come up in between that could be added or changed slightly? And so it's really important to just continue to check the progress, to regroup and reflect, and to maybe adjust your plan. And then support is something that we also touched on, I think is a really, really important thing. So it is good to have your plan and everything set and find courses and do all this sort of CV or whatever the failure was, to try and build that back up. But it's also about recognizing that you will feel disappointed if you've had a failure, and for the supervisor to realize that as well, and to give some emotional support, which I think, you know, is less talked about and we're probably less good at doing. So I think with that in mind, then I'm going to hand over to Luke for the next bit.
Yeah, thanks. So bringing all of that together, I think there's four key themes here, and the green circles are your failure friends. So those people who you feel okay about talking about when things have gone badly, and that's something that I've heard Varpio and Young talk about. It may not be your boss, it may not be your friend, but someone who's you feel comfortable talking about your weaknesses and your failures with, as well as sort of celebrating the successes. So 4 key themes from the previous research and literature. So self-esteem, you've got to protect that to be able to sort of move forwards. I really like this idea of generosity. So when you have a failure, you often feel really bitter, and you may think, you know, why am I doing this? You know, how am I going to, you know, I've almost that sort of feeling like a victim. But actually, if you've got the strength to sort of be kind to others, to help others in their career progression. Maybe my classic thing I try and do is, if I've had a hard time at work, is to teach the medical students about urology emergencies. It's just a topic that I'm comfortable talking about, and it just reignites that sort of spark and like why we do this. And I set up a program called the Tough Warrior Program, which is a charity project which gives support for trainees in this sort of difficulty, but it also fundraisers for charity. So just having a bit of a purpose can sort of reignite that sort of self-esteem in you and get you back on track. And in the sort of literature about what makes people succeed, this concept of grit is actually really common, and it's a better predictor of success and intelligence. So if you've had a disappointment, are you going to come back? Have you got the sort of, can you use that negativity to turn around and actually make it a really positive thing? And that is what you need to use to drive yourself on to the next stage, to reflect, look at what you can do better, and not just do better to pass the exam, but to come back and you know, really make a success and make yourself stronger than what you would have been otherwise. So that's it from sort of recapping about the podcast. So we could take any questions now, Shirley.
There's been no questions so far in the chat, but we could just pause for a moment if anybody wishes to post anything. While we're waiting, if anybody wants to post anything, I was interested in the use of the term grit one of the words that gets used a lot in this context is resilience. And I wondered if you wanted to try and talk about resilience versus grit.
Yeah, I think that's difficult. I think with resilience, all of these things come into play, and I think it's something that both the supervisor and the student needs to think about. So I think part of it's talking about your failures. So from a surgical point of view, I think, well, probably from all medics' point of view, we talk about burnout a lot in relation to resilience. And so I think this having a good relationship from the supervisor to the student, sort of setting objectives. And what we need to get better about in medical education is almost planning for failure, not just planning for success. So what'll happen if things don't go right? And often with medical school exams, a certain percentage of people are expected to fail. So is that actually a failure? You know, we need to just sort of talk about that more. And I think resilience is all of those things as well. So it's I think a lot of people would say it's similar to grit, but I think resilience is having a disappointment, whether it's a clinical one, whether it's a personal one, and still having the strength of character to be kind to those around you. And then I think once you sort of get back in track, you can put yourself up there, do that teaching session, and you start to feel better, and then you're in like a positive snowballing effect, and then you'll eventually get back on track.
We've got a few comments and questions come through the chat. We've got a question here, Luke. Can final year medical students join your Tough Warrior program?
Oh, of course. I can put that on Twitter, or I can, or you can Google it. So it's TUF is TUF. So it's the Urology Foundation. So if you can just Google it or get in touch with me. There's a few medical students who've done amazing things and done very well. So more than welcome.
Perhaps you could put a link in the chat maybe when you towards the end.
Yeah, I'll try and do that.
We've got a comment here that as supervisors, we should share our own failures more readily, and I agree with that. I think it's really powerful for trainees to know that their supervisors have been in the same boat. How do you find a failure friend? I like that term. If you keep moving jobs, rotations in hospitals.
Yeah, I think that's difficult. I mean, sometimes it's better to have someone not in your job. Some of the people I talk to are, old colleagues. So Saini's an example where I've never worked with Saini actually. I went to medical school with him, but he would be someone who I could have a frank discussion and say, "Oh, I really messed this up," or "I'm devastated about this." Or what do you think, Emma, or Saini?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think you'll probably be quite surprised that if, as we say, we're so bad at talking about failures. So if you start talking about them, then you may find people that you didn't realize had failed, and even if it's not the same exam or something, they can still relate to it if they've had failures in the past. We will all have had failures, so don't feel like you're the only one, and that you're going to find it hard to seek someone that has been through the same as you, because even if it's not exactly the same scenario, they'll have all the same feelings and the same thought process, and then you'll be able to support each other with how you got through that.
They often present themselves, don't they? So some people will avoid you when you're going through a bad time or don't know what to say, and then other people, reach out.
Yeah,
I think. Sorry, go on, Saini.
I was just going to say it's going to be a mixture of people outside and inside your bubble, and it kind of depends on what the failure is. So obviously, if it's an exam thing or something academic, probably your closer group of people you work with or your friends will naturally come up as that. But if it's a failure at work, it might be best to get someone who's detached from that clinical situation, because otherwise it might be difficult or involve someone else. So it depends on the scenario.
Luke's put the link to the Tough Warrior there. Thank you for that, Luke. Pam, I think, wanted to ask a question or make a comment. If we're able to unmute her, please, Lee. Maybe Pam will be able to speak. There we go. Off you go, Pam.
Yeah, Shirley, it was me that was asking on behalf of all those final year medical students who have what seems at the time the absolute ultimate disaster in their life when they find that they haven't passed their finals. So it was me that was asking about the Tough Warrior, because as someone who supports those students, it really rang true with me, the fact that let's divert them into something like tough warrior that is doing good at the same time as well. Great for their well-being. And it is just, I've totally agreed with everything you've said. In fact, your podcast I've shared with all my current students, unfortunately, in that position, but their self-esteem has been increased over the last few months, and they're all going to pass. So thanks for allowing me to unmute. I didn't mean to. I put it in the chat, so mute me now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Pam. And you're absolutely right. After I listened to your podcast as well, as I said earlier, I shared it with all of my tutors, saying, I really think we should all listen to this and share it with all of our educational supervisors as well. I think you've got some really good learning points there. One thing I wanted to pick up on, which I really liked, was when you, as one of the sort of pick-me-up tactics, was to reconnect with your original desires and motivations to do medicine, to study medicine, or to study your particular chosen specialty. And I wondered if you wanted to just talk a little bit more about that, because I think that's a really powerful tactic to try and reconnect that strong feeling.
Yeah, I don't know if I went about it deliberately or whether it's something I found by accident, but so maybe a couple of years ago when I failed one of my postgraduate exams, unfortunately, it's just such a massive disappointment. And then I just had an opportunity to teach some, I think it was medical students or F1s about urology emergencies, and like that's something I really enjoy teaching, and just sort of getting up there and then just sort of feeding off the enthusiasm of the students. And it bigs you up, doesn't it? Because suddenly you realize, well, actually, I know all of this stuff, and you're imparting so much knowledge. And within an hour with a group of medical students, it's probably the nature of my specialty, you can pretty much cover most of it. So it can turn into, so you feel like you've made a real impact in an hour. And then the other sort of clinical thing, it can be a clinical thing as well. So just something basic. So me seeing patients with blood in their urine, just that, doing your job well, seeing people who are anxious, giving good news, bad news. And in the course of a morning, you realize why you're doing what you're doing, and you're so ready to get on with the next steps.
That's great. I can't see any more comments or questions in the chat. Saini or Emma, is there anything more you'd like to comment on?
Just to echo kind of what Luke said about finding your feet again, and I think we're quite lucky to be in the position, certainly when you've left medical school. Yes, you've got postgraduate exams, which can be quite cumbersome, but actually you are a qualified doctor, and so you can fail an exam one day, and then the next day you're in charge of the ward or an acute take, saving lives. So just because you might on paper be listed as a failure, it doesn't detract in any way from your qualities as a clinician or an academic or whatever. And sometimes it's always good to kind of keep that sense of reality, and not get too down about it.
Thank you, Saini. Emma, was there anything more you wanted to add on the pick-me-up tactics to help people bounce back?
No, I think that is all true what they've said, and I would say the same. Where you're working the job that you're working in, you can, as Luke said and Saini said, then there's things that you can find that help, but also just thinking about yourself as to why you went into that in the first place, and reflecting on that yourself, and maybe thinking of something that you might enjoy. So it might not necessarily be at work, but I think it's also important to have time out of work and to have enjoyment there, and then things are put into perspective a lot better when you just have some downtime and some time to blow off steam a bit. So I think, both work things to know exactly why you want to continue going and to keep that grit going, but also to have some time where you don't have to be the high performer or the doctor or whatever. You can just be you. So
I suspect that COVID and all of the restrictions have made that aspect much more difficult to make contact with friends and family who support you. And, you use the term there, sort of let off a bit of steam. We're allowed at the house once a day. We can't do much, can we?
No.
So I think it's particularly hard at the moment. And I wondered if you had any tips for medical students or trainees about keeping themselves buoyant through these COVID restrictions.
I think it's hard at the minute as well, because some disappointments aren't actually failures. So people are having their exams cancelled, their job applications cancelled, and electives cancelled. It's really difficult time, and that's why we're doing this webinar now. I think it's just important to reach out to each other. So I think virtually that can be done either through the medical schools formally, but I think it's good to if you've had a disappointment, to reach out to others, but also if you know someone who's in that position, just make that extra effort just to say, well, sorry you're going through this, I failed last year, or I've had this other difficult thing, and then just to sort of talk about it. And we all have to make that a little bit more effort. We're all very good on sort of talking about our successes, and I'm on Twitter, and every day you're hearing about how great all my colleagues are and all the great things they've done. But it'd be good if people said, well, actually, I tried this and it didn't work out so well. So I think it's it's difficult, but I think we all just need to try and support each other.
There's a couple of comments in the chat. This is very true. I have learned more from these failures in my career than any successes. How true is that for all of us? Definitely something as doctors we need to talk more about. Thank you so much for talking about this. And then another comment, I love the normalize failure point. We'll add this to my induction. So, and another comment there, good idea, Pam, to normalize failure. I think that's absolutely right, that, it's normal not to be a high flyer all the time. It's normal to be in the middle or to bump along the bottom a little bit. It's okay to fail, and the important thing there is how you deal with it and what support you get, as you guys have quite rightly pointed out.
Yeah, I've found from a teaching perspective, so for those of you who like to teach students or colleagues or peers, it's normally the topics where you're talking about when something went wrong, where they're the most receptive, get the most from it, and it's the most gripping. So actually, in my teaching, it's actually been very useful to have quite a few of those experiences up your sleeve, because it normalizes it, as you said, and it's something that just makes a problem shared is a problem solved, they say.
In our department, we introduced a regular agenda item to our monthly meetings, which are adverse events and things that have gone wrong. Because in the beginning, people weren't talking about those things, but now we do. Everybody just chips in, or I prescribed the wrong dose of this, or I signed off a letter that had quite a big typo in there that could have been quite serious. So actually, we all learn from each other's failures and mistakes, and now we have a culture in our department to do that. And I would encourage you all to do the same when you're at your department meetings and team meetings. There's a message here that we need a cultural shift, and that's exactly what I'm talking about, is actually making it the culture to talk about things that have gone wrong and failures, and how you can, what you've learned from it, and how you can support each other. Absolutely. Emma, at this point, did you want to talk about the supervisor trainee relationship and how we can help here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I can just think about examples in the past where I've had supervisors, and some of them have been very good and some have been less helpful, shall we say. So in terms of thinking about the best example really for that was, as I spoke in the podcast, like recently when I didn't get that training job, I had a really great supervisor and who gave me a huge amount of support. And this was, as I said, it was both emotional support. So recognize that you will be disappointed. And so she did give me some time, first of all, just to self-reflect. And it's important, I think, for supervisors not to sort of, rush in there when someone's had a failure and try and get them to sort of reflect at that point, because they just need some time, as we've been saying. But then she gave me some time, and then we had a meeting, and the meeting was really good. First of all, she asked me before the meeting to reflect on all the comments and feedback that I had from the interview process, think about those, and we went through that list, and then that meant we were able to put a good plan in place for me for the rest of the year. But I think the important thing for that was that she, again, you know, I didn't feel judged. I didn't feel that I had a massive failure and that I couldn't come back from it. But, you know, trying to normalize it and recognize actually the positives of it, and, you know, in the grand scheme of things, how, you know, you don't necessarily come completely last. So it's not as if you are the complete failure, but just recognizing that there's a whole list of things that you would have done well in that interview process, for example, and building on those. And it's just about to try and build up to get your best outcome that you can. And so that meeting was good, but the thing that really helped was for her to support me through the year. So this was either, you know, if a course came through to her on email, she'd forward it to me if she thought it was helpful. Or, for example, if we're in our departmental meetings and, you know, if there was a teaching point that came up, she would direct a question to me as if it was in an interview process. And so if you think about it, for me, there's a lot of consultants around, there's other registrars and juniors. And so being put on the spot there is exactly like an interview. So it is a really good forum. And so just to try and, I would say for supervisors, to try and find ways, you know, within the day-to-day running of your department to also help whoever you're supervising. And that way I felt hugely supported. I felt I could go to her if I had any questions, no matter how stupid they were. And overall, just really, it is down to her that I was able to pick myself back up and improve my application, and then got the training job that I wanted. So
I think it's fantastic. I love hearing that. I love hearing about sort of good supervisors. So my original interest in this whole area came from when I applied for an ST3 job, and I was on nights at the time, and I went into the operating theatre where my supervisor was. He was scrubbed doing I won't say which part of the body because you'll guess, but he was doing a laparoscopic surgery, and he sort of turned and looked over his shoulder, and he shouted at me and said I was an embarrassment, I'd embarrassed the department, and that, you know, just, you know, what had I done, you know, all of this sort of stuff. And so I left that day, having done a night shift, you know, just absolutely, you know, devastated. And, you know, so there's I was really excited to hear that there's good supervisors out there as well. And I think supervision can be all sort of support. You can sometimes supervisors give the practical support, but not the emotional, or vice versa. And it sounds like Emma got, you know, absolutely everything. And in the podcast, Zaini mentioned about his sort of supervisor. Do you want to talk a bit more about that? Because that was incredible.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. So it was basically just describing, you know, something bad had happened clinically. Was feeling pretty bad about it, and I kind of wanted to speak to someone there and then. So I approached my consultant, who was busy with something else, and, you know, just said, you know, I've been through something. Can we talk about it? You know, now. And she just, what I was amazed by, she just managed to kind of make time stop, and just made me, you know, quite astonished. She just said, in a quite light-hearted fashion, she just said, do you mind if I just stop what I'm doing? And then why don't we sit down and have lunch together? And then, you know, kind of just brought everything down, calmed my emotions. She bought me lunch, and then actually set aside a good, you know, 45 minutes to just say, okay, what happened? How do you feel? Let me talk. And then she gave her opinion. And I just thought, it's such a simple thing, you know, buying someone lunch, picking a time in a room to talk together away from the shop floor, and just listen. I saw a comment in the chat saying that supervisors need training. You don't need to train people to do that. That's just a normal, common sense, good egg approach. And it had such a profound effect to me. And it, you know, it only happened about a month or so ago. But just simple things and picking the right moment to have that chat. It doesn't have to be immediate. And I think I had a much more productive outcome because of that chat, rather than if she did speak to me immediately when I sought her help, just say something for a minute and then that's the end of the matter. So I think picking the time and the moment is crucial.
But just to pick up your point there, Sony, about supervisor training, you're absolutely right. We don't need training to be humans and be kind to each other. But actually, I think supervisors, it can help them to have some frameworks and structures to deal with the trainee who's struggling. And I think that's one of the really valuable things about talking about this today and about your podcast, is you give some very nice structures and the steps of supporting somebody through the shock and disappointment, helping them through a reflection phase, and then helping them with planning. And I think that's something I've really taken away, and I've written it down. As you can see, I'm referring to it here. Now we're coming towards the end of our session, and it hasn't time flown because I think there's so much to talk about. But how rare is it that we talk about doctors' emotions and failures? And I'd like to commend all three of you and everybody else who's participated. Thank you for sharing your experience of failure. It's not easy to talk about those things. And I think it's been inspirational to hear how you've all persevered and how well you're all doing with your career plans. And that's the thing, everybody does get there in the end, don't they? So, it's just been wonderful to hear those things. I mean, I would like to, pick up this concept of being kind, and we're not probably kind enough to each other. And how important is it to be kind to each other in the current climate with COVID? If you can do one kind act a day to just somebody at work, it'll just make all the difference. So thank you so much to all of you. I'd like to just open the floor for any final comments or questions. If you have anything, please put it in the chat. So otherwise, we'll come to wrap up. I'd like to thank ASME for hosting this webinar today. Perhaps I could make a little plug there that there is a trainee ASME, which is called TASME. There's also a medical student part of ASME called JASME, and then we also have a student support special interest group called MEDISS. And all of those things, TASME, JASME and MEDISS, can all be found on the ASME website. So if you're interested in any of those, please do get involved. And there we are, we've got a slide up showing all of those things, which is great. Thank you, Lee. I'd like to thank all the speakers. As I said earlier, it's been wonderful to hear your experiences, and I'd like to thank you for your honesty. I'd like to thank all those who've attended and contributed to such a productive discussion. And I think at that point we will finish, and unless there's any final things to say. A video of the session will be made available on the ASME website in a few days. And I think finally, just to be sure to sign up to future bite-sized sessions. I think the wonderful thing about these bite-sizes, they're exactly that. They're quite short and sweet on one specific topic. And we are extending the program into 2021 with sessions every 4 to 6 weeks. And as I said earlier, for more information, please do visit the ASME web pages. So I'd like to thank everybody once again. And at that point, we will finish the webinar. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.